Welcome to a video on the topic of The Dark Tower by Stephen King. Bev Vincent is with me. He's the author of The Road to the Dark Tower, exploring Stephen King's magnum opus. It's a book all about the Tower novels. I'm currently reading it as I make my way back to the Tower for the second time. It's a very insightful read. You can see more about it in the description below. And I also want to let everyone know that there will be a timestamp down in the description as well for all of the topics that we cover herein. Bev, thanks for joining me. How you doing, man?
Thanks for having me on. I'm doing just fine, thanks.
We're going to talk about the Tower novels, but why don't I ask you up front, what brought you to write a book, a companion piece for the Tower series?
I have been writing a column for Cemetery Dance magazine since about 2000, 2001. Every issue I have a thing called News from the Dead Zone, which is King news and commentary and reviews. And as a result of that, people would ask me on occasion when I was going to write a book about Stephen King or his work. And my answer to that always was, that would be like a lifetime's work in itself. It would be like a doctoral thesis on steroids to try to cover his whole oeuvre, plus the fact that he's still churning out the books at a fairly rapid pace, so you'd be hard-pressed to keep up. But when I found out that he was going to finish the last 3 books in the Dark Tower series all at once, I got to thinking that this was a series of books that was manageable. At the time, it was only 7 books plus the tie-ins and the other novels. So you could address that series. But since it has connections to just about everything else that he's ever written, and it's been written over the entire span of his writing career, that it would also be some way of saying something significant perhaps about not only the Dark Tower series, but the greater King work without going into laborious depth into all the books. And so I pitched the idea. I think in those days it was probably a fax that I sent into King's office. And I said, I've got this idea. If you hate the idea, just say it and I'll move on to something else. But if you don't mind me working on this, my ideal would be to have a book that would be ready to be published immediately after the 7th book comes out, which was in 2004. I said, and really the only way that that would be possible is if I got to read the last 3 books in manuscript. And it was a daring ask. It was a big ask. But, if you don't ask the question, the answer is always no. So I asked, and I got a response back a day or 2 later saying the manuscripts are on the way. And so I took delivery of this FedEx shipment of 2,500 pages. I think it was 20 pounds of manuscripts that were the first drafts of the last 3 books, which let me then really tackle the book. And also it helped me get a publisher, because it showed that King was placing some faith in me by giving me these things 2 years before they'd be published. And that's where the work began on The Road to the Dark Tower.
So when did you first discover this series? Was it many years before you started writing about it that you had discovered it, or how did that go?
Like a lot of people who've been following King from the beginning, the first time I heard about the Dark Tower was when I got a copy of Pet Sematary, and it was listed in the front cover as one of his previously published books, and nobody knew what that book was at that time. And so for a long time, I haunted secondhand bookstores and libraries, and I had these big books in the bookstores. They didn't have the internet back then, so they just had books in print, and you keep looking through and trying to find it. Nobody could tell me how to get a copy. So ultimately, I wrote a letter to Stephen King, and the letter that I got back from him is reproduced in the first chapter of The Road to the Dark Tower. The first printing of The Gunslinger had already sold out, but because there was so much interest after Pet Sematary, he authorized a second hardcover printing of another 20,000 copies. And so I was able to get a copy of the hardcover edition about 1984, I would say. And because it was the only Dark Tower book that was available at the time, I read it quite a number of times before anything else came along. And so I was really, really familiar with it, really invested in it, I think, when the second book was announced.
So how close are you with King? Have you like worked directly with him while you were producing this book, or were you completely separated from him?
For that process, I asked him a couple of questions every now and then about tiny details that I thought were interesting. One question I asked was, I found this line in Wizard and Glass that seemed to imply that Roland wasn't an only child.
That he wasn't a what? What did you say?
Only child. Wasn't an only child.
Yes, yes.
And so I asked Steve about that, and he said that's pretty smart, but he wouldn't elaborate on it any further. And so a number of years later, when I was doing my second book, The Dark Tower Companion, I thought I'd try him again. And he told me a little bit more that time. He talked about Everlyn from The Wind Through the Keyhole, the woman who was in charge of the place where Roland's mother was sequestered. And he said she knows all about Roland's family. And I think he told me what Roland's sister's name was, but he didn't really go into it any further than that. But really, I did not bother him too much for that book. It was pretty much me working in complete isolation because nobody else, I couldn't talk to anybody else about anything that happened after Wizard and Glass. When I did The Dark Tower Companion, I did interview King. That was his contribution to that book. But before The Road to the Dark Tower was published, the publisher sent him an advance copy, and he gave us a nice quote for the cover, but he had no input into what I wrote in that book. The only time I've actually worked directly with him is when we co-edited the anthology Flight or Fright a couple of years ago.
Now, you have a short story in that collection as well, or do I have that wrong?
I do. Zombies on a Plane.
Yeah. That's one that I want to get. I've seen that you've done some work, and I really like Cemetery Dance as well. I actually have a hardback. They do these books of Kings every once in a while.
Yes.
Special edition kind of thing. But I do highly recommend your book, and there will be a link in the description for anyone who wants to check it out.
And so actually, that book you just held up, Blockade Billy, the other one, there's a character in there named Bev Vincent.
Wow, I didn't catch that. I did not catch that. I know that in that one, King actually makes an appearance in it, like he does in the latter portions of The Dark Tower. But correct me if I'm wrong, but someone's narrating a story in Blockade Billy, talking about a serial killing baseball player that they had once known. And the person that they're narrating to is actually Stephen King.
Right.
Now, let me ask you this. I know that he appears in the Dark Tower series, and we'll talk about that. Many people were turned off by that. I actually loved that part of it. I thought that was brilliant when he did that. But he appears in Blockade Billy. Does he make an appearance in any other books? I was just talking with someone about this the other day. I thought that maybe you would know that. Does King appear as a character in any other of his books?
There's a short story which was originally published in Heavy Metal called The Blue Air Compressor. And it was recently republished in an anthology that Hanzaka Lilia did, Shining in the Dark. And it is, it's very what you call meta-textual. There's a point where he sort of steps aside and says, I'm Steve King, and I'm the guy who's telling you this story. And it's very much that sort of even more overt, breaking the fourth wall presentation of himself. That's about the only case that I can think of where he directly appears as a character or a narrator. But of course, characters living in his books are aware of Stephen King, the author, and he is mentioned peripherally in any number of things, or his books are mentioned peripherally, not as sort of the tie-ins that you'd see in like the Castle Rock stories, but somebody saying, oh, that's just like out of that Stephen King novel, Carrie. And so he is a presence in the world of his fictions as well as the creator of it.
You said something about how sophisticated a project it would be to actually break King's catalog down and talk about all of the crossover and everything. You've actually done a great job with that in your book. And Robin Firth writes a concordance to the Dark Tower series. I'm actually using your book and her book right now as I'm doing a summary on the series, which has been a huge load of work for me. But this was mind-boggling to me. Yep. that she completed that, because she had to have read those books many, many times to get this information compiled.
And that was done as a project for King. When he was starting to work on the last 3 books, it had been a long time since he had read or worked on the earlier ones, and he needed a handy reference guide. So he hired Robin to produce this so that he could know what color somebody's eyes were, or what the name of a town was, and all those details.
Yeah, it's such a huge story as the Dark Tower. I wish that every epic series had a companion like that. I was really surprised. Like it's almost like a biblical concordance. It's so sophisticated, but it really is a great piece of work. And between that book and your book, I'm going to become an expert on this series soon. But let's talk about the actual plot of the story here for a moment. The first question that I have for us here is, who is Roland of Gilead? What is his ancestry? Why is he born into a quest for the Dark Tower? And I'll take this one first, and I'm sure you can elaborate on it in more depth than I can. But now I will tell you that I read the first book 4 times. The second book, I've completed it almost 4 times. The other books, I've only read them once, and it's been a while. So I'm really excited to get back through the drawing of the 3 again so that I can move on with the story. But Roland is the last gunslinger of Gilead, if I've got it right. And his father, Stephen Deschain, if that's the right pronunciation of the name, was the lead gunslinger of Gilead, highly respected. There's almost like a mystery when it comes to the gunslingers, and me just knowing exactly what they are. I know they were like police officers in Gilead long ago, but it seems like they were very highly respected, almost like they were some intermediary between God. They were so well respected, were the gunslingers. And Roland's the final gunslinger. And we even get some backstory in The Eyes of the Dragon with the line of Eld and the history of the gunslingers there. So he's on a quest for the tower. He doesn't know why, not sure exactly what the tower is. He does know that it's extremely important and that he's driven to get there, and he'll do anything to get there, even if it kills him. And I think one of the interesting parts in this story is that he's not even certain why he's after this, which is kind of unusual, I think, for an epic fantasy. I like the uniqueness in that part of it. Roland is kind of just arbitrarily cast on this journey, and he's not sure what's going on, but he's very committed. But yeah, he's the last gunslinger of Gilead. That's about all I can come up with. What do you got?
Well, if you think of the gunslingers as the Knights of the Round Table, that's sort of the level at which they exist in Gilead. And it's an apt analogy, because the head of the line of Eld is Arthur Eld, who you could think of as King Arthur. And the guns that Roland carries were forged from his sword, Excalibur. So there is an interlinking between the Arthurian mythos and the Gilead mythos of the gunslingers. He becomes a gunslinger at a very early age.
Let's say something on that. I've got to say something on that. I've actually gotten into debates with people over whether The Eyes of the Dragon is an Arthurian saga or if it's not. And it seems to me that there are so many connections there that it actually is an Arthurian tale with maybe a couple of names different. But that is an Arthurian tale. Or what do you think? Do you think that I'm wrong about that?
In a sense. It's...
Flag plays the evil Merlin in this one.
Yeah, and Merlin appears later on in The Wind Through the Keyhole as well. I think King's showing his influences, and one of the interesting things that I write about in the Road to the Dark Tower is all of the different influences the King drew upon in creating these series. He was inspired by The Lord of the Rings to create this epic-sized story. I mean, he had an idea right from the beginning that it was going to be thousands of pages long. He was inspired by the westerns, the Sergio Aragoni, Sergio Leone westerns in creating Roland himself, and drawing directly on the plot of The Magnificent Seven for the 5th book in the series. So the influences are vast, and certainly the Arthurian legend is a big one. He becomes a gunslinger at an early age because he's sort of challenged by the evil forces that are trying to overthrow Gilead, And so he takes his test to be a gunslinger at an earlier age than anybody, even his father. And it's a big risk, because if he fails, it means that he'll be banished forever. And, will never be able to come back to Gilead. But he succeeds, and then he's immediately sent into exile by his father, along with some friends, because they're in danger. And it's at the end of this exile quest where Roland really gets his calling to go on the quest for the Dark Tower, and he gets it via the grapefruit, the purple orb, and he sees what will happen and is motivated in much the way that the Knights of the Round Table were motivated to search for the Holy Grail. It's something that you have to do, you have to acquire, you have to save, without really understanding what the nature of it is and what the bigger picture is of why you're doing it.
So it's kind of an archetypal story that we've seen throughout history many times. That
Absolutely.
Leave it to me to jump around a little bit, but I want to talk about the Lord of the Rings influence here, because this is kind of weird for me. I want to know what you think about it. King is obviously a big fan of the Lord of the Rings. He wanted to write his own Lord of the Rings epic, so he writes The Stand. And it's about the same length as the Lord of the Rings. You can see a lot of parallels. The Lord of the Rings comes up more than several times in the novel. And I'm curious, did he want to tell the Lord of the Rings twice, so he went on to write yet another epic quest story? I'm just curious what you think there. It looks like he actually kind of wrote his own version of the Lord of the Rings twice.
Possibly. He'd begun the Dark Tower long before he came up with The Stand. In the first parts of the Gunslinger were written while he was still in college, and it wasn't until he was already an established author that he started working on The Stand. I think the Stand is, it was inspired by news stories that he saw about chemical spills that could have caused a real catastrophe, and he was inspired to decimate the country. And then see what was left of the people, who were left behind, to see how they pull together. And so there is a bit of a cross-country questing element to it, but it's different from the Lord of the Rings in that the characters don't really have a mission. They just know that they're drawn either to the good or to the evil entities. And it's only once they get there that they decide, well, okay, we have to go to Mordor and take care of Sauron in metaphor. Whereas in the Dark Tower series, it's more of a quest, and he gathers a fellowship along the way. Roland does. He picks up people who will help him in much the way that Frodo was given. He had people that he brought with him, and then he was given other people who helped him. And I like to think that Roland was given the people who become his quartet as well. I think Ka gave him the people that he needed, even though he didn't know he needed these people, because they certainly weren't people he would have picked for himself. A junkie, a woman with no legs who has split personality disorder, a boy. He wouldn't have picked those as companions, but they were exactly what he needed.
Yeah, I'm reading the drawing of the three for the fourth time, and I've just come across. I'm actually finishing up the first part where he gets Eddie Dean, and he's wondering in his mind, why in the world was I drawn to this person? He can't make sense out of why he has to draw Eddie Dean into his company, but he does it anyway because he knows that that's his quest. But going on the information that was given to him by Flag and the Oracle in the previous novel, he knew that he was going to come across Eddie Dean, and that a power more insightful than himself had set it up that way. So, that is very interesting that you mentioned that he wouldn't have selected those people. Let's talk about The Stand and It for a moment here. How exactly do The Stand, when I think of Stephen King's great accomplishments, I think of three things particularly. His two great novels, The Stand and It. If you ask people which one they liked more, around 60% of the time I've gotten The Stand, and around 40% of the time I've gotten It. But those are his two epic length novels, and of course his magnum opus, which is the Dark Tower series. When it comes to The Stand, I know that somewhere in Wizard and Glass, the characters kind of come to be in the dimension of space and time where the stand is taking place, and then they pass out of that, if I have that right. There's that fact, and there's the fact that Randall Flagg is a recurring character. Is there anything beyond that that connects the stand with the Tower series?
Not really. I mean, Flagg, of course, is the main through line. And he's the villain of the stand, and he's the sort of the villain of the Dark Tower series, although I might argue that he's not really as big a villain as he presents himself to be, in that he's really he's sort of like the wizard in the Wizard of Oz. He turns out to be a bit of a humbug behind the curtain when you actually get to him. But yeah, there's the crossover through into at the Emerald Palace when they cross over into the world of the stand, but it's a different world than the one in the stand. It has all the hallmarks of things that show that you're at a different level of the tower. The brands of the cars are different. The names of the baseball teams are different, and so Nozala is the drink. So you're in another version of the world where the virus happened, but it's not the exact same copy of the world that happened in the Stand novel, which itself happens in 3 different timelines, because there's the version that King first wrote, and
Yes.
then when it came out in paperback, he updated the
Right.
timeline, so it happened later. And then when he did the uncut, unabridged version, it happens in yet another timeline. So there's 3 timelines where that one happens.
That is true. The original copy of the Stand, the edited version that King cut down himself, took place in 1980, I believe. When the paperback came out in 1982, it was updated in 1985. Like, they were trying to keep the timeline current for people that were buying the book in the modern age. And then when King implemented the majority of what he had taken out before for the uncut edition, it had been moved up yet again to 1990 with some cultural references, like Madonna comes up in the book, which wouldn't have been in the 1980 version. It's interesting because when I was reading the Dark Tower series, Wizard and Glass, it was some years ago that I read it, and I had not read The Stand at that point. So I didn't even catch on to what was going on with them entering into the landscape of the Stand. But that's interesting that you mentioned that it was a different dimension of space and time that they passed through, not the particular one that takes place in the novel The Stand, but a different one. And I'm going to really enjoy that when I get that far back into it, because I'll pick up on it this time. But how does it play in? Because the thing that's sticking out with me for it, because I read The Stand and it within the last 6 months for the first time, the turtle is a big part of it. And if you read it and you haven't read anything to do with the tower, it would probably seem really just awkward that there's a turtle there. It's not really explained at all, but it has some kind of major importance. We know that the monster, that apparently is some kind of feminine being that is so wicked that our senses cannot perceive it in its natural form. We see it as a spider, but that's not really who she is. And she apparently comes from another universe, if I've got that right. Of course, I've only read it once, but that's the big connection that I see there. I know the beam is mentioned a few times throughout it, but that's what I see with that novel. How is Stephen King's epic novel It tied to the Tower series?
Rob, no, I think you've hit most of it, but the one that people question and talk about the most is the general similarity between it, Pennywise, and the character Dandolo, who shows up in the 7th book in the Dark Tower series. And a lot of people were asking, are they the same entity? To the extent that King answered on his website to say that Dandolo and Pennywise are not the same entity, but they are probably of the same race. They probably come from the same place. Pennywise fed on people's fears. That was what he was all about. Whereas Dandolo fed on, he made people laugh and drained their energy. They were both sort of psychic vampires in that sense. So there's a similarity between them, but they're not the same character. But certainly people who've read both books would look at Dandolo and say, well, that reminds me an awful lot of Pennywise. And I think he even puts up the aspect of a clown at some point.
Okay, if he's doing that, then he definitely had it in mind. Because I was thinking, I wonder if he originally intended it like that. But if he's relating it to a clown, he would have almost had to have intended it like that. Yeah, so that's what I see with The Stand and It. Other than Randall Flagg and the fact that they kind of go through a different dimension of space and time related to the epidemic that's taking place, there's not huge connections there between those two novels, which was a surprise to me when I read them. But let's go on here. Many people that pick the first book up, they're not big on it. I don't see it as far as the way I've interpreted that book. I just love that book. It's the book that I've read more than any other book, 4 times. However, there seems to be an explosion of imagination. So the question for you is, with book 2, there's an explosion of imagination and artistic maturity and capability went between the Gunslinger and the Drawing of the Three. But how does Stephen King's writing style change between the Gunslinger and the Drawing of the Three? What about his storytelling process? What are the strengths of each approach?
I've always looked at the Gunslinger as a mood piece. For me, the most memorable part of it is just this overall mood that comes with the story. I mean, the linear plot, if you were to write it out, is, Roland's running across the desert. He picks up this boy. They chase this guy, and they sit down and have a talk. And then there's the flashbacks, of course, to the things that came in Roland's past. So there's not a lot of forward momentum action in that story. A lot of it is just this world building, the way that people talk about, when you're creating a fantasy universe. He's setting out the rules for what Roland's midworld is like. But you have to remember that he started working on this when he was, 19, 20, 21. And so his writing was a little bit more overblown than some of his later things are. He uses some very unusual words that sometimes maybe even not correctly. And you have to remember that the first 4 books were never edited when they were originally published. So we get to see them essentially the way King wrote them without any editorial input into them, which is why there are such glaring errors, like, the directions get all messed up and characters' names change from one book to the next.
Yeah.
The sorts of things that a professional publisher would have helped catch and smooth out. And so that's one aspect of it, is you're seeing the raw, unadulterated, unedited, pure King, even all the way up to Wizard and Glass. But definitely, the story of the Gunslinger is very insular. It's Roland. It's all Roland. It's in his head. He's interacting with Jake and he's interacting with some other characters, but it's very claustrophobic. By the time you get to the Drawing of the Three, Roland gets some friends. He has people who he's interacting with, and their stories are as important as Roland's story is. And we know a little bit about Jake's story from the Gunslinger, but we find out a lot more about him in the later books. And so it's just the whole world blossoms. And by the time he writes that book, I think his style has developed from the other novels that he's had published, and also working with editors on the other books. I think he's probably a better craftsman, and the whole scope of that, the second book is at least twice as long, if not more, than the first one, which was written in installments. The first book, he wrote 5 short stories and tagged them together to turn them into a novel, whereas the Drawing of the Three is a full and proper novel. It was intended that way from beginning to end.
Yeah, I'd love to have those original serial magazine publications. I don't know if it's possible to get those or not. If I could have any 2 Stephen King books for my collection, the first one I would probably have is Rage. I'd like to have that old paperback. It kills me online. Every time I see someone that gets it at a library sale for $1, it just kills me inside.
Well, you can get it. It's a lot easier to find the Bachman books. The 4
I have
books.
a Bachman books, but I want that Rage. I know that you understand my desire for that book. If I could have another book, it would probably be a first edition of the Gunslinger novel. I'd like to have that one. I'm not sure what that goes for now, if it's $1,000 for a copy or what it is, but it is true that Stephen King, it's hard for me to say what is better about the drawing of the three, other than the fact that I enjoyed it more because I'm not an author and I can't, point out the different techniques that he used, but I will say that drawing of the three is a damn good book. That's probably why I continued on reading it. I think it's my favorite of the series. It's just such an imaginative venture. And I'll tell you, I'm summarizing the series right now, and I did my episode on the Gunslinger, and you're correct about how the fact that it's very linear, very little thinking back to the past. When it comes to the drawing of the three, it's a huge challenge for me to try to summarize this in a linear fashion because things are jumping all around in time and everything. I'll make sense of it all, but it is true that it's more of a sophisticated read in that way. King was hit by a minivan. By the way, the drawing of the three is my favorite installment of the series. Which is your own favorite?
I always have a hard time with favorites. I don't think that way very, very often. But I guess I'd have to say the Gunslinger, just because it was the first, and for so long it was the only one. And I reread it so often that I feel intimately familiar with it, to the extent that when he revised it just prior to the publication of the last three Dark Tower books, I've read the revised version once or twice, but I always go back to the original when I want to reread it for pleasure.
Well, let's talk just for a moment about the differences between the two, because I've never read that original novel. I have it here. You're going to get a kick out of this book I show you in a moment, but I have the original paperback. I've yet to read it. Check out this. Now, I want to ask you if you think this was a coincidence or not. I found a novel, an old Western by Al Conroy. It's called The Man in Black. It was on it was on a shelf in a used paperback mart, and the price on the sticker is 19 cents. And I immediately thought, whoever put that on there must have been making a connection, but the store owner didn't seem to know hardly anything about Stephen King. So I think it truly is a coincidence. The Man in Black.
Everything's 19.
But I haven't read it. I know that in the original version, there are two characters that are merged into one, and that becomes Randall Flagg, I think. So maybe you can just elaborate on the actual differences between the two novels for a moment.
Well, we started with the 5 short stories that were published in fantasy and science fiction, and they were published over a span of 3 or 4 years. And so at the beginning of each installment, there was always a synopsis of what happened in the previous story. And you can actually see during that process of the publication of those 5 things, King's evolution of his thinking about who the Man in Black, Walter, Martin, who are all these characters? Are they all the same? Are they distinct? He hadn't really worked that all out for himself. And when I interviewed him for the Dark Tower Companion, I was asking about Farson, because Farson is a character who people said, oh, that's just another version of Flagg. And I didn't think so, but I wanted to get it straight from King. And King said, no, he said, Farson's just some guy, he's like Flagg. He's just like a henchman. But he said, I could never really figure out in my own mind the real relationship between Walter and Martin and the Man in Black. So that's something that even he, thinks about. But the main thing that he did in rewriting and revising the first book was, when he wrote the first book, he didn't know what the ending was going to be. And if he had written the Dark Tower series as a novel, the way he writes his other books, when he gets to the end, you go back and you go through and you add things in early on that help lead readers towards what's ultimately going to happen. And so that's the main thing that he did. He drops in the 19, which doesn't exist in the original version. So when Roland is in Tull, the 19 thing comes up. And there's sort of references to the Tajín and Algol Ciento that aren't present in the original version. So it's more, hey, I discovered all this stuff about Midworld. Roland should know about this stuff earlier on. So he just, introduces that stuff earlier.
I know he kind of changes something inside Alice's tavern there. I think it had to do with maybe Sheb in the original version, he didn't know him, but in the revised version, he actually remembered him from Hambury many years ago. I'm not sure how all that goes, but I should actually read them back to back sometime. I could breeze through them pretty quickly, and I probably will. But let's talk about King's accident here. He was hit by a minivan, 1999, nearly killed the man. Very serious thing that happened to King. And people use these terms, old Stephen King and new Stephen King. And I actually recently read Different Seasons for the first time. And I actually like a lot of King's new novels. Duma Key, I loved it. Under the Dome, I absolutely loved it. But people say that there's a difference in the quality of his writing or the style of his writing or some combination of those after the accident. People see a big difference between the Gunslinger and the Drawing of the Three and the third book, the fourth book in the series. I kind of see it in three different parts. There was the Gunslinger, then there was book 2, 3, and 4. Then King was hit by a minivan, and the third part of the series I see is book 5, 6, and 7. It seems to me that the Wolves of the Calla, it kind of fits with what comes before, but it's where Song of Susannah where the style really just changes up. What do you think about King's accident and how the last 3 books in the series came together?
I would say that there's a noticeable shift in King's writing, starting with Bag of Bones, when he moved to Scribner, which this is pre-accident. And he definitely becomes more determined to pay attention to language. And his publisher, Scribner, that he moved to from Viking, was known as a literary publisher. And so he sort of embraced literary references. In the Bag of Bones is very much inspired by Daphne du Maurier, Manderley story. And so that, progresses through Hearts in Atlantis, which is a Dark Tower adjacent book. And I would say that the main difference after his accident, there's a lot of reference to pain and recovery from pain. Starting with Dreamcatcher, there's a character who's hit by a car and is suffering. He's trying to get back to the way he was before. You mentioned Duma Key. There's a guy who suffered a severe, life-altering accident, and he's experiencing pain, trying to get back to it again, and that recurs fairly often in many of the books that come, I would say, in the decade after his accident. It's pain was such a constant part of his life for such a big chunk of time that it had a major impact on the things he wanted to write about, the things he wanted to delve into. Lisey's story came out of the fact that he almost died again because of a lung injury from the accident that cropped up again a number of years later. And so he has a character who's a writer who actually does die from a type of injury. And he's sort of dealing with that, the pain, the loss, the potential loss. He liked to joke that, people's reaction to his accident was, oh no, now he's never going to finish the Dark Tower series. It wasn't like, oh no, Stephen King is going to die, or, his poor family or something like that. It was all about, oh no, now we'll never find out what happens to the Dark Tower.
Yeah, it just goes to show you how important a piece of artwork can be to somebody that consumes.
Well, he used to get letters in the early days because the books were so widely spread apart. His office would get these letters saying, when's the next one going to come out? And there was one famous incident where somebody sent in a photograph of a teddy bear chained up, and they said, finish the next Dark Tower book or the teddy bear dies.
I'm sure you've heard of the one where the lady that was going to pass away tried to contact him to ask just secretly what was going to happen. And he replied to her that he wasn't sure what was going to happen, so he couldn't tell her. That's very interesting. What was I on about there? I had a question. Oh yeah, when it comes to Duma Key, people try to see these in every King novel, even if there's nothing there. People will try to see these connections to the Tower series. What's interesting in Duma Key is that Edgar Fremantle can paint and kind of alter reality through this painting that he does, which is very similar to what Patrick Danville does in the Dark Tower series. So I'm not sure if that was intentional by King or not. And I don't even know which book was published first or whatnot, but I see that. And of course, Hearts in Atlantis. So let's talk about the three big connections to the Tower series. When I think about things that have an intimate influence with the Tower series, I see actually four things. The short story, The Little Sisters. Of course, that's kind of like a prelude. That's actually part of that story. I see Insomnia. I see Black House. And I see Low Men in Yellow Coats. And I think of those, Insomnia is probably the most intimately bound. It's all about the Tower. It's about, in Insomnia, we have kind of like what I see as a chess game going on between the Crimson King and Gan, or God, from the Tower series. And the Crimson King is trying to manipulate the world through Ed Deepenow, if that's how his name's spelled. And Gan is using Ralph Roberts as they're pitted against one another over Patrick Danville. The Crimson King knows, being an omniscient being, presumably, that Patrick Danville is going to be a problem for him when it comes to the final showdown. So he's trying to get in there and kill him and wipe him out so that he can face the Gunslinger by himself at the Tower. Or at least that's what I see that's going on there. And it's just all about the Tower. What are your thoughts on Insomnia and what it means to the plot of the Dark Tower series?
So my take on Insomnia is that it shouldn't be taken literally. I would say that if you think of Stephen King as the voice of Gan,
yeah,
the storyteller who's telling the story of the Dark Tower, Insomnia is a highly metaphorical allegory for what's going on. But there are enough contradictions between the literal story of Insomnia and what we know to be true in the Dark Tower series that I've always taken it more as an allegory. And, you know, when they produced a copy of the book Insomnia in the Dark Tower series and say, you know, this is the keynote book and it's got all these clues in it. To me, that's what it is. It's, in the context of the Dark Tower universe, it's King writing clues to himself, perhaps, about what the Dark Tower series is really all about.
So do you think that when King wrote Insomnia that he intentionally kind of put some contradictions in there? Or do you think that that was maybe not intentional?
I don't know if it was intentional. I mean, there was a good span of years. I mean, Insomnia's early 90s. He may have changed his mind about certain things. I mean, the description of what the Tower is and the levels of the Tower is subtly different than what we find out it is in the Dark Tower series. Again, the levels of the Tower in Insomnia are sort of like a hierarchy of elevated beings rather than different realities. So I just think that his thoughts evolved. And then working with Peter Straub on Black House, I think they both got a chance to play around in that universe. And, you know, I look at them as, you know, when a stand-up comic is preparing a series, he goes out on the road and he tests things out to see, you know, what works and doesn't work. I look at these as sort of test cases, experiments to, you know, what's this really all about? Who is this Crimson King? What is that? And let's play around with this and see if we can come up with some ideas. And then whatever he developed in those books, he then applied some elements of them in the actual Dark Tower novels themselves.
Maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but perhaps what happened in Insomnia could have been on some other dimension of space and time, not the story that we read about in the Dark Tower series necessarily, but some other version of it out there somewhere in another cosmos. You know, Black House, I thought, was maybe not as intimately connected as Insomnia. You know, it's more about Jack Sawyer and what's going on there. Of course, they're trying to get a beam breaker. They're trying to get a really powerful boy who's a strong beam breaker, not maybe as strong as Ted Brodigan, but he's a strong beam breaker, and the Crimson King wants him. And they play on Albert Fish, which is kind of weird because I had read a true crime book about Albert Fish not long before I read Black House, so I knew all about him. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about Black House.
But certainly the Talisman, which is the book previous, there are allusions that the land that Jack is able to flip to is not Midworld, but it is a territory that is known to Midworld. And in fact, in Little Sisters of Eluria, that's made a little bit more concrete. That, you know, the tent that he goes into where the queen is, that's somewhere that could be available to Roland if he happened to wander off into that part of his universe. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that we don't know very much about the big scale of all of Midworld. We know a little slice that goes from, you know, where Roland and Eddie encounter Shardik and they catch the beam and they start heading down towards the tower. That's just a little sliver of what I think of as a disc-shaped world. And then we find out later that Gilead was on sort of the north beam, but that's just a little piece of the pie. There's a lot of the rest of Midworld where who knows what's going on, and presumably the territories are somewhere in that realm. So there's that connection. Clearly, you know, there's the Crimson King and the Breakers. Yeah. You know, and you know, whenever you invite a co-author in, you sort of let somebody else play around in your toy box for a while, and but then when you gather up your toys at the end of the day and go home, you get to put them back in the order that you want. And so I think again they were bouncing ideas off each other about what this stuff all could mean. You know, King has said that, you know, he during the 90s everything he wrote was about the Dark Tower at one level or another. Rose Madder has an incursion into the land of the Dark Tower when she goes through the painting, and they talk about the bodies hanging from the lampposts in the city of Lud. You know, so it was always on his mind. And then, you know, he finally got around to by, you know, 2000-ish to say, okay, I'm ready to just put the pedal to the metal and finish this off.
You know, it's interesting because in some way, Peter Straub has written some part of the Tower, co-authoring with Stephen King in Black House. When it comes to Hearts in Atlantis, it's my favorite Stephen King book. I really love that one. I don't know why I enjoyed it so much, but maybe it was the time and I was at the right time and place when I read it, but I just loved that one. And I loved Low Men in Yellow Coats. You know, I tried to read it years ago before I had read the Tower novels, and I just didn't like it. I couldn't finish it. I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on with that. And I was surprised that they made a movie. They actually made a movie where anyone who watched it that had not read the Tower novels wouldn't understand what was really going on in the background that was driving everything in the film. However, after I read the Tower novels and I read it, I just loved that story. I loved that damn story with Ted Brodigan. Ted Brodigan in the Tower series is trapped in the Blue Heaven prison, and they're using him to wreck the beams, and he manages to like travel out of there. He somehow time travels out of there, and he goes to the world where Bobby Garfield lives, and he tries to hide. He's just a criminal, a convict in hiding in some dimension of space and time. And the Crimson King has Loma out there searching for him out in the multiverse, trying to hunt him down. And it's just a very unique and bizarre and outstanding story to me. I'm just curious what you thought of it.
Yeah, no, I mean, whenever you know, Steve goes full Dark Tower in something that's not part of the Dark Tower, it's always fascinating. You know, the Low Men make other appearances. There's a short story called which was you know, it's about a Kindle with you know, a special function in it that has access to other universes where Hemingway and Faulkner wrote different books than they wrote in our world. And, you know, this guy gets this Kindle delivered to his house, and he starts doing, you know, he starts finding out things about his own future, and he tries to change things. And at the end, he gets a visit by the Low Men and said, yeah, we need that back. And they talk about the rose. And then clearly the vehicle in from a Buick 8 is a Low Man's car. And it provides access to some other reality which has, you know, horrific creatures in it. So it may be part of the blasted lands, or it may be just some interdimensional space that's going off into. But yeah, so they show up from time to time.
They also show up in The Regulators, which is a novel that I really disliked, but there are low men, very bizarre story is The Regulators. I wasn't a fan of it, but I know that they're there. They're driving vehicles in it. That's about all I can remember. But it's
that started its life as a Western, as a pure Western. He was going to write a pure Western with Sam Peckinpah, the famous movie director, and Peckinpah died. So he had this full thing called The Shotgunners. And when he was working on Desperation, he came up with the idea to do this sort of crazy inside-out reality where he takes the same characters from one and just sort of jumbles them up and throws them into another one. And the only, you know, the real connection between the two of them is the evil entity. Otherwise, they're, you know, the characters are completely different, even though their names, you know, somebody's son becomes somebody else's father, and it was just I think an experiment.
Were you a fan of that one, or were you not big on it?
I would say I liked The Regulators well enough. I think Desperation's I think I would say I like Desperation more. And Desperation, again, has Dark Tower connections because it takes place in the Desitoya Mountains, which is where Little Sisters of Eluria takes place. And the language that Tak uses is the language of the informed that shows up in Little Sisters of Eluria and other stories.
When I was a kid, I used to read, you know, children's books and YA novels when I got a little bit older. I liked Goosebumps. I like these sports-themed YA novels that were like 80 pages or whatever. But anyway, at some point when I was a very young teenager, I picked up my first adult novel. And it was either Desperation by Stephen King or it was A Time to Kill by John Grisham. I can't remember which novel it was. I loved both of those books, though. And I liked Desperation so much, probably because being used to reading YA, it was just a much deeper, more sophisticated read. It was about life and death and all this crazy stuff that was going on. And it was a gruesome, violent,
right out of the gate, things go bad very fast. Yep.
Yeah, right out of the gate, Tak's got control of the Kali and Trajan, and he's out setting people up, bringing them into the jail. I think Tak actually kills everything in the damn town. The last person around is Kali and Trajan. So Tak uses Kali to go out and start pulling people in from outside so that it could destroy them. Yep. It was a really great novel. I love that one. So I had these huge expectations for The Regulators, and I just didn't like it. I wanted it to be similar to Desperation. But when it comes to From a Buick 8, you know, that was a novel that I thought was an okay novel. It was kind of, in some sense, it really was a kind of this beautiful little drama taking place in this small town with this group of, you know, mostly good people. However, it was a little lacking in the pacing area, I thought. And I know other people have thought that. But the car was interesting because as the book opens up, you know, sometimes when I'm reading, the author will describe something in the novel that reminds me of a place that I really know. And I imagine it playing out there at the place that I really know. And there's this little gas station in Alliance, Ohio that kind of sounds similar to the little gas station that opens up with From a Buick 8. But anyway, the low man drops the car off and the car transports someplace. And it appears as though it goes to Midworld. I'm not sure if that's right or wrong. Can you just tell me if I'm right about that, or where does that car go to in that? Because I know that's what connects it to the towers, that damn car.
Yeah, I would say that it connects, in my mind, it connects to Todash space, where there are the creatures that exist between realities. And the things that come flying out of the trunk of that car is what makes me think that, you know, the things that can't even exist in our atmosphere for very long. So they probably didn't exist in Roland's world either, because they couldn't survive in, you know, a normal atmosphere. So I've always sort of adopted the belief that it's into a Todash space, and there are probably many different kinds of Todash spaces.
Yeah, I do remember that, though it's been some time since I read it. It was some real unusual stuff that was going on. If you could get to where that car took you, it was, I don't know if it was like radioactive and just strange physics. I think it was strange physics in that place. But, you know, From a Buick 8 was a decent novel. I thought it was okay. I doubt I'll ever reread it, but it was interesting with that car. Maybe I should have started with this, but I'm someone who has only ever completed one epic fantasy series in my life. That's The Dark Tower by Stephen King. I've read some pieces of some other ones. I'm reading The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. And I want to ask you this to set up for the next question, which why King's epic is different from most others. But how is, or what does an epic fantasy series, how does it differ from other literary works? And how is the experience of reading something like an epic series different from reading a novel?
Well, the first thing is the world building element of it. You have to find a way to bring the readers on board to know what are the rules of this world. This is a world where there are wizards and little guys with hairy feet, or this is a world where it seems like it's a medieval world, but there are actually dragons and some elements of magic, like in the Game of Thrones, or it's a world where there is a guy who has a special ring which gives him all sorts of power, like in Stephen R. Donaldson's series. So that's the first thing, is the author has to build a world and then populate it with not just a present, but a past, a history that's completely different from what we know, and a geography which is completely different from what we know. And so in creating Midworld, for example, he has to come up with the mythos of Gilead, the history of the Gunslingers, what the world used to be like before we're introduced to it, by which point those people are all dead, everything's gone to hell, the machinery's all gone, everything's running down, even time is starting to act weird. And so that's where we're dropped into it. But prior to that, the author has to have imagined everything. Even if they don't write it down, they have to have imagined everything that got the world to that position, so that the readers believe this reality and are not just sitting there asking, well, why is he doing that? What's that all about? Just swept along with the story. And then there's the element, of course, of, it's epic, it's huge, it's 7 books, it's 12 books, it's 9 books. And each one should be, in some sense, its own story, so that, when you get to the end of it and the author's, taken 2 or 3 years to write the next volume, or in King's case, sometimes 6 or 7 years to write the next one.
Yeah.
But you feel like you're not left hanging, although he did do that to us at the end of the Wastelands. He really left us in a cliffhanger there for 6 or 7 years on that bloody train.
Yeah.
But you think of George Martin's The Game of Thrones. Each book is a story that you could sit down and read and be satisfied that you've read a novel, but it's just a brick in the bigger wall of the whole scope of what the big story that they're trying to tell. And King, he's not a plotter. He always says he doesn't, like you said, he couldn't tell that dying woman what was going to happen, but he knew enough early on, the afterword to the Gunslinger, that he had the rough shape of what the series was going to be like sketched out. He knew that there were going to be 7 volumes, and I think he had a plan, but that doesn't mean that the plan didn't change. And certainly his accident was something he couldn't have anticipated. And so writing himself into the story and making his potential death being, an important factor in Roland's existence couldn't have occurred to him, in the 1970s and 1980s when he was working on the early parts of the book. So it evolves, but it's mostly about scope. It's the hugest canvas that you could ever imagine to tell a story on.
It really is incredible. It's just a journey. I was really surprised when I read the Dark Tower series, because it was unlike any reading experience I had ever had. Of course, I had read novels and loved them up until that point, but there's something you can do with an epic series that's at least 4 or 5 books long, that's well over 1 million words at the minimum, where there is, like you said, background and scope and depth and many character relations and generations that are going by. You know, it's just this huge dramatic thing, and it would be a challenge. I'm someone who can't even write a damn short story, so it would be a lot of work. You know, there's a lot more that goes into it than what there are in the novels, with the author having to go and invent everything in his mind. But, you know, it really is a reading experience. It's quite incredible. Why do you think that King's epic is different than so many others? Now, I said I never finished another one, but I've read books in other series. Malazan, Book of the Fallen, I'm in. Game of Thrones, I'm in right now. I'm now reading the First Law trilogy. I'm 3.5 books in to Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive, these high-end things that are kind of your typical fantasy. What makes Stephen King's series different than a lot of these other popular, successful, epic stories?
I would say, with one exception that I'll mention if I remember in a few minutes, most fantasy series take place exclusively in a fantasy world. And the big difference with King's series is it's as equally rooted in our familiar world as it is in the mythical world of Midworld. And the bouncing back and forth between the two realities, which is something that he also did with Straub in, you know, the Talisman series, makes it maybe perhaps more relatable, because you're not always just running around with a bunch of elves and orcs and trolls. You've got normal people living in New York City or in rural Maine. And so there's an element of familiarity to it. And the other series that comes to mind where there is at least some footing in our reality is the, I don't know if there's 9 books now or 12. It's the Stephen R. Donaldson books that start with Lord Fowl's Bane. Yeah. And it's about this guy who is has leprosy, and he gets sucked into another world where his wedding ring is the most powerful talisman there is. But he spends a large part of those books, they're called the books of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever.
Yeah, I have one here. Lord Fowl's Bane, I have it, haven't read it yet. He
refuses to believe that he's in this alternate world. So he's the unbeliever. And so he does some really horrible things because he thinks nothing matters. This isn't a reality. He's having a delusion or a nightmare or something like that. You know, he's a man from our world who is forced to deal with things that are completely beyond his experience and try to salvage the place that's called the land in those books against his own will. And at the end of each book, he usually gets shunted back to his real world, and then he gets pulled back in again. And it's just like, you know, what's real? What's not real? And, you know, I think the people who get drawn into Roland's world, Eddie and the others, and certainly Susannah, you know, Odetta, she has a hard time accepting what's happening to her. She doesn't really believe that she's in this other place, and she thinks that they're monkeying around with her, and so there's that element of the same experience that the reader has. We're drawn from our world into this fantasy world. But I would say the other big difference with King's fantasy series, his epic series, is it's everything mixed together. It's science fiction, it's horror, it's Western. He really, you know, takes everything he can possibly get his hands on and blends it all together into this one sweeping saga.
Yeah, that is true. You know, one thing that's coming to mind that's different is that there aren't any maps in the Dark Tower series. I would have liked to have seen a map created by King that shows where everything's at, because there are actually some maps out there that like conflict with one another, where people have tried to put them together on their own. But another thing that's different is, and maybe it's not all that different, but Roland is like an anti-hero, maybe in some sense. He's ready to kill and betray and lie. And that's not Frodo Baggins. That's not Sam Gamgee, right? So, by the way, I have read
but
the
it is
Lord.
Thomas Covenant. Thomas Covenant is a really hard character to like. But so we talked a little bit earlier about, people having a hard time getting into the Gunslinger, and
Yeah.
part of that I think is because Roland is such a bastard. And so when people ask me, how, what's a good entrance into the series, I often recommend starting with the Little Sisters of Illyria, because it takes place earlier in his journey, and he's a little bit more accessible. He's not as unlikable as he can become in the Gunslinger. And so I think if you spend, 50 or 60 pages with him in Little Sisters of Illyria, you're maybe a little bit more open then to go along for the ride of the Gunslinger.
I think Roland may be the most beloved. Well, of course, there are so many people that read King that haven't read those Tower novels. People really love the Losers Club, particularly. They really love the group of kids in The Body, which I recently read for the first time. They love the characters in The Stand. But I just love those characters in the Dark Tower. That's another thing that's kind of different when it comes to an epic series that's like at least 4 or 5 lengthy books, is that the author can just take a lot of time to put in the backgrounds for the people and to develop them. And people fall in love with those characters like Roland and Susannah. And
I would say one difference with some of the other epic quests is that King keeps the cast of characters fairly small. If you're reading Game of Thrones, you need a lookup chart to know the 15 members of this family and the 17 members of that family and all of their ancestors and offshoots and all that. Whereas, ultimately there are a lot of secondary and minor characters, but there's very small core group of characters that you're spending all of this time with.
Yeah, and even technically speaking, there were never that many members of the quartet. There were the 3 that were drawn, which was we have Eddie and Susannah, who is a merging of Detta and Odetta Walker. We have Jake. Oy is an official member of the quartet, I believe. Per Callahan comes in as an official member of the quartet at some point. What did you think about Salem's Lot? That's a really interesting book because, like, Insomnia comes into the Dark Tower series where they produce a copy of it, but it's all about the tower inside the book. But if you were to actually just read Salem's Lot, it ain't about the Dark Tower. However, from the reverse look, it's just crazy what happens with that. How Per comes in and he's got the book and everything. That was just such an imaginative thing, I thought. I thought Stephen King is a damn genius with this shit when he did that. What did you think about the role that Salem's Lot played in the series?
Well,
and we're people had often
asked King about whether he would tell the story of what happened after Salem's Lot, if he would do a sequel to it. And he said he thought that he'd pretty much tied up that story. The only character he was interested in was what happened to Father Callahan after he got on the bus and rode out of Salem's Lot. And so all these years later, he got the chance to bring Father Callahan through our world, but a world that has vampires, and slowly draw him across into the world of the Dark Tower and plunk him down in this, sort of bohemian little, Calla in the edge of End World, and give him a life. And he's got his church. He built his church, and he's tried to rehabilitate himself for the things that he did in Salem's Lot, and do his penance and help the people of the Caliber and Sturgis. And so I think it's a lovely story. And then to sort of whop him up the side of the head by showing him that he's actually a character in somebody else's book, and just the existential confusion that has to cause with a character to say, but hey, this is my life, but no, this guy actually created my life.
It's been a while since I read Salem's Lot. And I do know that toward the end of the book, Per Callahan gets on a bus and he just goes, and you don't get any more about him. But what it turns out that he's on a quest for the damn tower, or at least to help assist Roland to get to the tower, because he's a badass in it. I remember he's killing and everything. Per Callahan comes in. I'm not sure if there were any other official members of the quartet other than the ones that I mentioned. There might have been. I wanted to mention because you talked about King having such a long period of time. A lot of people complain about George R. Martin's books, and I know that it's been longer than the amount of time that King took to finish his series, but it was like 20-something years, wasn't it, for King to complete that thing?
Well, the first one came out in 1982, and the last one came out, the seventh book came out in 2004. And then, of course, there was The Wind Through the Keyhole, which is sort of a nice little coda thereafter. But yeah, so it took him 22 years of publishing.
Right.
But unlike George R. R. Martin, there wasn't a TV series going on to keep people fired up and misled to a certain extent, because obviously the stories diverged at a certain point when they ran out of books and they had to keep on going on their own.
I might as well ask you what you thought of the movie.
Okay. I had the pleasure of interviewing Ron Howard and Akiva Goldsman for The Dark Tower Companion right after it was announced that they were going to make a movie. And Akiva Goldsman and Ron Howard had a really sophisticated plan for what they were going to do. They saw a series of movies with interstitial TV series. And so the movies would be the large action oriented set pieces, and the limited TV series would be the more intimate drama, character.
That sounds great.
So like the story of Magus, that could have been a little limited TV series.
Wow.
And so they had that big plan. And they were very open with me. I spent probably an hour with each of them, and they laid out exactly what their plan was and the reasoning why they were doing it that way. And the part of the reason alludes to what we said about the Gunslinger earlier, is it's not a very cinematic action story. And if you want to launch a franchise of big budget movies, you don't launch it with the Gunslinger. And so when the movie came out, ultimately without Ron Howard or Akiva Goldsman involved in it, I had an idea of what the approach was going to be. And I think the main difficulty with the movie is that the studios didn't have any faith in it. And so they kept, paring back the budget, so that we ended up with this 90-minute movie, which I really, I came out of that and enjoyed it a lot. And I thought Idris Elba cast as Roland was inspired. Matthew McConaughey as Flag was okay. I wasn't as sold on that. But I did something that I rarely do, is I saw the movie in Bangor with a group from Sony and some other people like Robin Firth and Richard Chismar from Cemetery Dance.
Yeah.
And I came back to Texas, and 2 days later, I went out and saw the movie a second time within like a 2-day span. And it's not a popular opinion, but I appreciate what they did, and I enjoyed the movie for what it was.
I'm kind of split over the movie, because I thought, just as a movie, in and of itself, that it actually was a pretty good movie. However, there was the part of me that read the books, and I thought, what in the hell is this? It was because, the actual plot was changed. The tower was something else, and Roland's quest wasn't to get the Crimson King. It was to go after Flag. It was just a mess in that respect. But just as a movie, I thought it was actually okay. But what I would like to see would be what you said would have been great, if they would have action movies and then a television series in between. That could have gotten really good. And the only reason I mention it is because you said A Game of Thrones really brought life to George R. R. Martin's series. People will wait till the end of time to get those novels after the network series, but it would just be nice if someone could sit down, even on a low budget sci-fi channel kind of thing, to actually try to tell the story like it is.
Well, there was a plan. There was a plan through Amazon to do the Wizard and Glass adaptation, and they actually filmed a pilot. So it was Glenn Mazzara working on the story, and that was the story of young Roland in Gilead. And they had the whole thing all mapped out, but Amazon didn't pick up the pilot. And so that sort of died on the vine.
That's a real shame. That's a real shame. I don't know what it would come out to be like, but I would certainly watch it. I'd love to see that story told at least close to the way that it's told in the books. I picked this up, and we're going to move on to our final question here and talk about the way that the story ends. Charlie the Choo Choo. And I mention it because you talked about the uniqueness of this story, how there's fantasy and science fiction and horror elements, and a lot of it's a Western, a lot of time travel going back and forth. It really is incredible. And this is a very special piece of the Dark Tower because in the Dark Tower series, I can't remember if it's the drawing of the three or if it's the Wastelands. I think it's the drawing of the three. I haven't gotten back to that part yet as I'm going back through it. I'm about halfway through now, but this book actually shows up inside the book, which is quite interesting. Now, this reads like a pleasant little children's novel. It actually is a pretty good children's book. I was surprised by it. And you probably wouldn't notice it if you were a child that picked it up, but the children are crying on the train.
Yep,
of course,
and that's a pretty evil-looking face on the front of Charlie the Choo Choo.
Indeed,
so here's your Easter egg du jour. In the first episode of Lisey's story on Apple TV, there's a character who is obsessed with the writer. And he goes into a library and he finds a copy of that book, Charlie the Choo Choo. Wow. And he said, this is the first book that this Scott Landon ever read. And he was so inspired by this book. And they make a big deal of it. They show the copy of Charlie the Choo Choo. And it's like a huge Easter egg in Lisey's story.
Well, that would be interesting. I've not seen the show. I have read the novel, but that would be quite interesting. I should check that out. I need to watch more movies. I'm not big on movies. I probably watch a few every year, but I should pick up that Lisey story. That was a novel that I started and I stopped after 100 pages. I just wasn't into it. Someone encouraged me to continue on. And like with the drawing of the three, there was like an explosion of imagination that happened somewhere in that Lisey story. I actually thought it was a pretty good book. But let's talk about the ending of the story here. This was something I want to ask you what you thought about it and what it means, because there's a lot of talk about what's really going on with this. And there's talk that if they made like a Netflix series, that this time around Roland would have the horn with him when the series starts. That way King could maybe end it differently if he had any influence on what actually happened with it. But what happens is that the gunslinger gets to the tower with Patrick Danville. And the first thing that was kind of disappointing to me, I was disgruntled about, was the final battle. I do like the fact that he paid homage to Harry Potter in Wolves of the Calla and the Dark Tower novel with the weapons. Plus, in Wolves of the Calla, the weapons, the sneeches actually come in a box, a crate, with a lightning bolt burned into it, which I just loved that. I thought it was brilliant. But the final battle was anticlimactic for me. I wanted a showdown. I was waiting for a showdown this whole time. And the gunslinger utilizes, it looks like the gunslinger actually is just helpless at the final battle. The Crimson King is using the sneech. He can't hit him with that gun. And it's up to Patrick Danville to draw, and then like Edgar Fremantle, to erase the Crimson King. The Crimson King stuck out on a balcony, and I want to know what you think about that. But Roland ascends the tower. He gets to the top of the tower, and he's kicked back out into the desert chasing Randall Flagg. But this time around, he retains the Horn of Eld that he lost last time around, or in a different dimension. He lost the Horn of Eld at the Battle of Jericho Hill when he was a teenager, fighting with the young quartet that was with him, with Cuthbert and Jamie. So I was disappointed, I guess. When I first finished the story, I was just very upset about the ending. I didn't like it. However, when I started rereading the first book and the second book for the second time around, I seen that the ending was actually forecasted. Maybe King didn't know the whole time exactly what was going to happen, but Flagg tells Roland that he'll never die, that things will keep repeating. It's all throughout it. So I guess the ending's grown on me a bit, but just tell me generally, what did you think of the ending to the story?
So you have to put this into context. Here I am sitting with my 2,500 pages of loose leaf, reading through it for the first time. And I have a day job. And so I do my writing stuff in the morning before I go off to my day job. And I got down to the point where I had maybe 100 pages left. And I'm looking at the clock and I'm saying, I can't stop. And so I was late to work that day. I just tore on through. And, you get to the point where King warns readers. He said, maybe you don't want to go anywhere beyond this because, things are not maybe going to be to your liking. But I absolutely loved, I didn't think that the series could have ended any other way. I think the last line being the same as the first line, to me, that was just the perfect symmetry. But I have a lot of theories and ideas. And so when Roland ends up in the desert again with the horn, to me, that's a signifier that he is not Roland. He's Roland 2.0. He's a little bit more improved. He's on a little bit higher level of the tower. And what that means is that at the Battle of Jericho Hill, he wasn't so obsessed with the tower that he couldn't take his eyes away from the quest long enough to pick up the horn. He had room to look around and take in what was going on around him. And what that means to me is that some of the choices that he's going to be faced with in the future on the next go around will be maybe handled differently. Maybe he won't let Jake fall under the mountain. And what are the repercussions of that? And I'm even open to the possibility that the quartet that gets assembled for him beyond that will consist of different people, because Ka will decide this Roland needs this set of companions, maybe a little bit different characteristics, different qualities. I would be open to that. But I've always thought that Roland's fatal flaw was going into the tower. His quest was to save the tower. And he essentially did that when they freed the Breakers. But he still had the Crimson King to deal with. And, the Crimson King has powers to do things. He's the disruptor. So getting rid of the Crimson King, yeah, he should have done that too. But in my mind, it was hubris then to think that he should go into the tower, because his goal by entering the tower was to know the face of God, to find out what is this reality all about. And of course, he gets slapped down for doing that. And I have this alternate reality version that I like to talk about, to say, okay, he defeats the Crimson King and then he just walks away. He goes back to Calabrin Sturgis, and he and Rosalita Munoz lives out a normal, happy life. He dies a happy old man, the sheriff of Calabrin Sturgis. And that to me is the only redemption I think that Roland could ever get.
Have you ever considered writing that?
No, it's in my head. It's in my head, and I've talked about it in different interviews. But that, to me, that's always been my happy ending for Roland.
So maybe what you're saying is that Roland is maybe lacking in discipline or some kind of positive attribute that made him reckless, and that was why he dropped the horn, or he didn't retrieve the horn at Jericho Hill. And if he could grow and evolve to the point where he could actually reject the tower at the end of the story, then he could have the peace that he needs to die a normal death or live a normal life, not drawn on by that obsession, and to just be done with the whole thing.
That's my theory.
Okay. That's pretty interesting. I have a kind of an alternative ending that probably isn't as good as yours, but I actually was reading the series once, and I knew an old man that was reading it, and he had been reading it. I had been reading it. We hadn't got to the end of it yet. And I asked him, what do you think's going to happen when the gunslinger gets to the tower? And it was his idea that the quartet would ascend the tower together and come to the top. And when they stepped into the room at the top, they would be looking into a mirror, and their images would be reflected back on them. And they would find that it was them, the pursuers of justice, that held the multiverse together. And I don't even know exactly what that means, but it was kind of interesting. I liked maybe what he was going for with that. Now, the Crimson King is locked out on the tower. Presumably, the Crimson King actually wants to get into the top of the tower. I'm curious what you think about why he was actually locked outside for that final battle.
Well, one of the interesting things about some of the villains in King, and Randall Flagg is the epitome of this, is they're not invincible, they're not all-knowing, and they're fallible. And so, Randall Flagg, everything Randall Flagg tried to do ultimately failed, whether it's in The Stand, whether it's as Flagg in The Eyes of the Dragon, or it's his attempt to bring down Roland in the Dark Tower series. And so when he gets taken off the map, not by Roland, but by Roland's offspring, and people complained that was, anticlimactic, and, they wanted to see the big confrontation. To me, it was just like the perfect comeuppance for Roland to say, you think you're running things, but you overstepped your bounds. You thought you were more than you were, and you just got knocked down, ultimately destroyed. The Crimson King is insane, has been insane, because he used to live in his castle just with nothing to think about but the tower, and it drove him mad. And I think he just made a stupid mistake. He got into the first floor and he went out and he just got locked out. It sounds very trite to say that, but he just got locked out. And that was his punishment, I guess, by the tower, whatever. This close but no closer. You thought you were going to destroy us, but you're just shut on the outside looking in. It's sort of a comeuppance for a character who thinks that they're going to rule the world after they destroy the world, without them really having any comprehension of how stupid that sounds. It was just a way of saying, yeah, you thought you knew what you were doing, but really you didn't.
I can't remember how the story ends because it's been probably not quite 10 years since I read the Dark Tower novel. And I'm looking forward to getting back and seeing everything. But I know that some of the quartet die at the end. And then there's something about, in maybe some other dimension of reality, they're still alive. And I think maybe Eddie and Susannah are sitting on a park bench somewhere while the Gunslinger goes off to finish things. I can't remember how that happens, but I'm curious, in your version of the story, where the Gunslinger rejects the tower at the end, is there some alternate conclusion for the quartet in that case?
Well, the quartet ends up in a fairly happy place, all things considered. I guess we're doing spoilers left and right here. Jake and Eddie are both killed in Midworld. Susannah accompanies Roland almost all the way to the tower, but then Patrick draws a door for her and sends her back to New York, where she meets up with Eddie and Jake, who are now brothers, and they don't know each other, but they know each other, and there's a depth of understanding. And it's another New York, and they even though the story isn't written down, they could have had a happy life together, away from all the horrible things that happened to them by having been drawn into Roland's reality. They get their reward, I would say.
Yeah, now I guess the last thing that we'll touch on here is, I guess when I read it, maybe it's because I hadn't thought it through enough times, but Roland King gives us this ending that is this repeating wheel. Destiny is a wheel. But he also does throw one thing in to say that it could be different in another case where Roland retains the Horn of Eld. Now, presumably that's a different Roland in a different dimension of space and time that's on their way to the tower. But I know there's something in the book that when Roland gets to the tower, he's supposed to sound that horn and speak off the names of the people that helped him along the way, or whatever that was about. So it seems to me as when Roland gets to the tower, there are a certain set series of events that have to happen for this to be the final trip to the top, where something will happen that we don't know what it is. But he misses a step. The Horn of Eld is not sounded. And presumably, if the Horn of Eld is sounded, then the conditions will be different for whatever is going to occur. And I thought, well, maybe this very time around, if he gets there and he sounds that horn and he goes to the top of the steps, he won't step back into the desert chasing Flagg, but some other thing will happen. So I'm just curious. I know you're talking about Roland may have to make it back to the tower many more times before he retires as a sheriff in Culliver and Sturgis. But could this be the final trip with the Horn of Eld, or who knows?
That's up to the individual reader at this point to make that decision for themselves. When I interviewed King for the Dark Tower Companion, I did ask him that. And he said, what's his wording was something like, improvement is gradual. And so the fact that Roland has the horn is a gradual improvement, but he needs to improve a lot. It's not the magic bullet. It's not the elixir that fixes everything. It's just a sign that he's a little bit better this time. And the Roland that we saw in the books as we read them was a little bit better than the one before that. And it's sort of like this reincarnation theory of, you keep being reborn until you are perfect. And what does perfection look like for Roland? Well, every reader, I think, gets to decide that for themselves. But I think of this, I call him Roland 2.0, but he might be Roland 19.0. Maybe he has to get to 99.0 before he reaches perfection. But that's my theory of it all. But everybody else gets to decide that for themselves.